Hey guys, this is Mr. Hodges, and we're going to be talking about relative pronouns from stage 15 for your stage 15 test. While you're doing this, if you're watching this for the first time, you're going to want to go to It's Learning and access the relative clause notes, which is located under week 15 or with the other stage 15 materials. So let's get going. All right, we're going to start out with relative pronouns in English, which we know as who, whom, or which. So in these sentences, I want you to find the relative pronoun and then find the antecedent. And that would require knowing what an antecedent is. So first, let's start by looking at the different relative pronouns here. All right. Well, in this first sentence, you have Michaelis, who set free all the rabid cats, was sentenced to 10 years in jail. Okay. You'll see the relative pronoun here, in this case, who, and it begins what we call a relative clause. And in English, we typically set off relative clauses in the middle of a sentence or at the end of a sentence. We set it off with a comma. It has its own subject. In this case, it would be who, which is our relative pronoun. It has its own verb, set free, and the rest of a predicate. In this case, a direct object, which would be all the rabid cats. So, who set free all the rabid cats is our relative clause. It starts with our relative pronoun who, and then that leads us to our antecedent. Well, every pronoun in a sentence has to refer back to something. So in this case, who in the relative clause is referring back to Michaelis. That makes Michaelis the antecedent to the pronoun who. So in this sentence, you can see we have a couple of different subjects. You have the subject in the main sentence, Michaelis, and you have the subject in the relative clause, who. Relative clauses act like their own mini sentences within a bigger sentence, and we'll talk more about that later. So just to keep it simple, who is our relative pronoun and is referring back to its antecedent, Michaelis. So, and it typically gives more information. So Michaelis, who set free all the rabid cats, was sentenced to 10 years in jail. So the subject in the main sentence is Michaelis. The direct object, there is no direct object in the main sentence. If we look in the relative clause, we have the subject who, and then we have the direct object, all the rabid cats, receiving the action, set free. Okay. Down here, we have the man in the suit, whom I shot, only grew in size. We have our relative pronoun here, whom, starts the relative clause, whom I shot. And you have to ask yourself, what does whom refer back to? And you have to look back into the main sentence, and you'll see that we're referring to the man, or more completely, the man in the suit. The man will be your simple subject. The man in the suit would be your complete subject. And so, the antecedent of the pronoun whom is the man. That's what whom is referring to. And so if we look in the main sentence, we see that the subject in the main sentence is man, and we see that the verb is grew. And once again, we don't have a direct object in the main sentence. Now let's look at the relative clause. We have whom I shot. And you have to ask who's doing the action here. The action in the relative clause is shot. And it's not whom doing the shooting this time, it's I. Well, and we have to ask ourselves, who is receiving the shot? Well, that's whom. That makes whom in this sentence the direct object. So, whom I shot. Down here we have the pool, which has been calling my name, was discovered to be underchlorinated. We start out with our subject in the main sentence is pool. We say, which has been calling my name? Well, we find our relative pronoun here, which. And which is referring back to the pool. That makes which the relative pronoun and pool its antecedent. So if we look in the main sentence, the pool was discovered to be underchlorinated. We have our subject, pool, and it was discovered. And there's really no direct object there. There's nothing receiving that action. We just have was is our verb, and it's describing the pool, linking verb. But if we look at the relative clause, we have which has been calling my name. We have which is our subject in here, doing the action, which has been calling. And the thing that's being called is my name. That makes name, or more completely, my name, the direct object in here. That's how they work in English. Let's look how they work in Latin. They're very similar. So before we get going, we have to define some terms here. We have relative pronouns. A relative pronoun is a pronoun that refers to a previously used noun in the sentence and introduces what we call a relative clause. We typically, in English, recognize relative pronouns as words like that, which, or who, or in our case, whom as well. A clause itself is a portion of a sentence containing its own subject and verb. A relative clause is a clause that begins with a relative pronoun. So in Latin, in English, the relative pronouns are who or which. In Latin, we show these words with qui, quae, or quod. Here's an example of a Latin sentence that has a relative clause. Servi, qui regum salutaverunt, aulam lawat. You can see here that the relative clause looks very similar, is set up very similar to the way it is in English. Set off with commas, which isn't always the case in actual Latin, but in our softball Latin, it works. You'll see these here. We have the word qui, which we know means who, and you can see that we have our own little sentence here with a verb and a direct object, and then we have our main sentence that has its own subject, verb, and direct object. This ends up meaning the slaves, servi, qui regum salutaverunt, who greeted the king. We have aulam lawat, clean the palace. In this sentence, qui is our relative pronoun, referring back to its antecedent servi, and that's what qui refers to. And so that makes our whole relative clause qui regum salutaverunt. You may want to take a second and pause this and fill in the chart on your this chart on your notes. To answer the question, relative pronouns in Latin, unlike kind of like adjectives, which agree with their noun and case number and gender, relative pronouns only have to agree with their antecedent in gender and number. The case doesn't have to match its antecedent. It can be a different case. And so we'll see. Here are all the different forms. You'll notice we have masculine, feminine, and neuter forms of relative pronouns. These lines where it just goes all the way across, that means it's the same whether it's masculine, feminine, or neuter. So I'll read them out loud while you write. Nominative singular, we have qui, quae, quod. Dative singular, cui, cui, cui. Accusative singular, quem, quam, quod. And the ablative singular, quo, qua, quo. The nominative plural, very similar to the nominative singular, is qui, quae, and for the neuter, it stays quae. Dative plural, we have quibus, quibus, quibus. Then we have our accusative plural, quos, quas, and quae. And for our ablative plural, we have quibus, quibus, quibus. I'm about to change to the next slide, so if you want, you can pause this here. Okay. Relative clauses, in general, unlike adjectives, the relative pronoun that begins the relative clause can have a different case than its antecedents. Let's look at this sentence right here. Agricolae quos ego audivi in agro laborabat. That means agricolae, the farmers, quos ego audivi, whom I heard in agro laborabat, were working in the field. Quos is our relative pronoun, and it's referring back to agricolae, or farmers. In this sentence, farmers is nominative plural. It's the subject of the main sentence, and this should actually be laborabant. I apologize for that. Either way, agricolae is nominative plural, but if we look in our relative clause, it starts with quos, which refers back to agricolae. It's plural, just like agricolae. It's masculine, just like agricolae, but instead of being nominative, in this case, it's accusative. And that's how we get this. We get the relative clause meaning whom I heard. In this relative clause, whom is being used as a direct object. That's how we show direct objects, the direct object of who in English, by changing it to whom. So even though out here in the main sentence, farmers is the subject, its pronoun that refers back to it in its relative clause is acting as the direct object. That means it's important to pay attention to the subject of relative clauses. You have to look at the verb in there and see if it agrees with the relative pronoun. If it's something other than third person singular or plural, then it's definitely not going. The subject is definitely not of the relative clause is not going to be the relative pronoun. In this case, the subject is I, shown by ego and the I at the end of audivi. Furthermore, you just really have to pay attention to the cases of words. Notice how quos is accusative plural. If you see that, then you know it's definitely not the subject. And you'd have to find something else in the nominative, or just look at the noun to see who the subject is. Okay, so here are some examples from About the Language 1 through 6. I'm asking you guys to underline the relative clause and draw an arrow to the antecedent. And I would like for you to translate 3, 4, and 5. This is on page 58 in your packet or textbook if you're accessing it online. And it's the questions at the bottom. I think it's part C. I'll give you guys a second to do this. Please pause if you are about to start working because I'm about to go over the answers. Okay. So we have number 1. Rex qui sceptrum tenebat in atrio sedebat. Okay? We have our relative pronoun here, qui. I want you to underline that. And I would like for you to draw an arrow to its antecedent. What is qui referring to in this sentence? Well, typically, one rule of thumb is that typically the relative pronoun is referring to the noun that occurs right before the relative clause. In this case, it'd be rex. Rex is masculine singular nominative, and qui is masculine singular. So they agree in that way. Number 2, we have vinum quod savius bibebat erat optimum. That in this sentence, quod is our relative pronoun, meaning which, and it refers back to vinum. Vinum is neuter nominative singular, and in this sentence, quod is neuter and singular. But instead of being nominative in this case, it is the accusative. And though quod is both nominative and accusative, you can tell because we have savius here, which is in the nominative case, and that makes it the subject of this verb. So this means the wine which Savius was drinking was great, or was the best. All right, now we have 3, 4, and 5. You have to translate these. In this sentence, we have quae, which is our relative pronoun, referring back to enchilai, which is our antecedent. This sentence, when you translate it, comes out to be the slave girls who were afraid of the master fled or hurried from the house. Actually, it's not fled. It would just be hurried from the house. All right, number 4, we have our pronoun quem, referring back to canis, making canis the antecedent. And this sentence translated as the dog whom Bregens was leading, ferocissimus erat, was very ferocious, or was the most ferocious. Number 5, we have in via erant multi Britanni, qui Romanos impediebant. We have a relative clause here, qui, referring back to Britanni. And this sentence translated means in the street there were many Brits, or there were many Brits in the street, but you want the relative pronoun to refer back to Brits. So in the street there were many Brits who were blocking or who were delaying or hindering the Romans. In number 6, we have cana quam volubilis parabat erat splendida. That quam right there, kind of being blocked, is our relative pronoun. It is referring back to cana. Cana is feminine. It is nominative singular. You notice that quam is feminine and singular, but it's accusative in this sentence. And that's relative pronouns. I know these can be a little confusing. It really just takes practice, but they're set up very similar to English. So a lot of times just translating straight across will give you the right result. On your test, you can expect to be asked to identify what the antecedent is. You will be expected to be able to fill in the blank with the proper relative pronoun that agrees with the antecedent in gender and number. And ultimately, you'll be expected to translate it properly. I hope this is helpful. If you have any questions, please message me on It's Learning or ask me in class. I hope you guys have a good day and good luck.